In the months before February 2022, as Russian forces were quietly massing on Ukraine's border and the world was debating whether Vladimir Putin would actually pull the trigger, the FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service, its most powerful intelligence agency, the organization Putin himself came from, was sending messages to its network of informants inside Kyiv. The messages were urgent and consistent. Leave your homes. Russia is coming. Kyiv will be a war zone within days. One intercepted message showed an FSB officer telling his informant to have a successful trip. That is how certain Russia's intelligence apparatus was about the outcome of the invasion. It had spent 8 years preparing. The war would be short, Ukraine would fold, and nobody in Putin's inner circle needed to worry about the corners they had been cutting, the reports they had been falsifying, or the billions of rubles they had been quietly redirecting into their own accounts. Because Russia was going to win so decisively that none of it would ever matter. They were wrong by, in the words of a U.S. official who later reviewed Russia's pre-war intelligence assessments, a mile. Ukraine did not fold. Kyiv did not fall. And the FSB's catastrophic failure to accurately assess what Russia was walking into, a failure built on years of corruption, wishful thinking, and telling Putin exactly what he wanted to hear, sent more than 100,000 Russian soldiers into a war that was nothing like the one they had been promised. The question is not just how this happened. The question is whether Putin ever understood that the organization he trusted most had been robbing him blind while handing him a fantasy. Christopher Steele spent years running the Russia desk at Britain's MI6 intelligence service before becoming one of the most scrutinized private intelligence analysts in the world. In late 2024, speaking to the Trump Report, he made an assessment that reframes the entire trajectory of Russia's Ukraine failure. Between 2014, when Russia first seized Crimea and began supporting separatists in the Donbass, and 2022, Putin allocated what Steele estimates was up to $5 billion to FSB operations in Ukraine. This was not military spending. It was intelligence and covert operations money, funds designated for subverting Ukraine's political institutions, cultivating networks of informants and collaborators, building the shadow infrastructure of a pro-Russian alternative government that would step in the moment Russian tanks crossed the border. The plan, as Putin understood it, was to arrive at a country that had already been hollowed out from the inside. A lot of that money, Steele says, simply disappeared into the pockets of FSB officers and FSB businesses and was utterly corruptly embezzled from the effort. $5 billion, spent over 8 years, on an operation that was supposed to guarantee the success of the most significant Russian military campaign since the Second World War, and a substantial portion of it never reached its intended purpose, because the people entrusted to spend it spent it on themselves instead. Steele offers no documentary proof of the specific figure, and the nature of covert financial flows makes independent verification close to impossible. But the claim does not require a single leaked document to be credible. It requires only a close reading of what was happening inside the FSB during exactly that 8-year period, because the evidence of systemic, industrial-scale corruption is not hidden. It is, in some cases, a matter of public court record. In July 2017, a scandal erupted inside the FSB that the Warsaw Institute described as evidence of an organization already collapsing into internal warfare. At the center of it was Sergei Chemezov, one of the FSB's most powerful figures and the head of Rostec, Russia's state defense corporation. Rostec controls a research institute that manufactures detonators for Russian military ammunition. In other words, it sits at the heart of the war machine Putin would eventually deploy against Ukraine. A group of FSB officers investigating the institute discovered that salaries were being paid to positions that did not exist, ghost employees collecting paychecks that were flowing somewhere. Rather than report this to their superiors, the officers attempted to extort bribes from the institute's board in exchange for burying the discovery. Kamezov had the 5 officers arrested. He did not do this out of any commitment to institutional integrity. He did it because those officers were attempting to shake down the operation that was funneling money into his own pocket. The corruption he exposed was real. The corruption he was concealing was larger. 2 years later, in May 2019, investigators searching the apartment of Colonel Kirill Cherkilin, a former FSB officer who had headed the agency's Financial Counterintelligence Unit, the department specifically responsible for detecting exactly this kind of theft, left carrying several large bags containing 12 billion rubles. At the exchange rate of the time, approximately $185 million in cash in his apartment. The initial charge against Cherkilin had been accepting bribes worth $850,000. The apartment suggested the actual figure was somewhat higher. The particular irony is that Cherkilin's department had conducted high-profile investigations into Russian oligarchs and government ministers accused of corruption. He was the man Putin trusted to find the thieves. He was one of the largest thieves in the building. He was convicted in 2021 and sentenced to 7 years. Not alone, but alongside 2 fellow FSB officers who had been operating as his accomplices throughout. The third case arrives in February 2024, by which point Russia has been at war in Ukraine for 2 years. A gang of 24 high-ranking law enforcement officials, FSB officers, and members of Russia's investigative committee fabricated a murder case against the co-owners of Merlion, one of Russia's largest household appliance companies. The accusation was that the 3 businessmen had hired a veteran of the Donbass War to assassinate their former CEO by throwing Molotov cocktails at his house. The story was implausible. It was also sufficient to land the 3 men in pretrial detention for 6 months, while a corrupt lawyer working for the FSB presented them with the exit terms: $200 million, plus 2% of Merlion's annual turnover, indefinitely. The businessmen refused. The scheme unraveled. 24 officials were exposed, and in the middle of a war that Russia was struggling to sustain, nearly 24 of the country's senior law enforcement figures had been spending their professional energy constructing an extortion operation against a home appliance retailer. Each of these cases is individually a story about greed and institutional rot. Together they are something more specific, a portrait of an intelligence agency that spent the 8 years of its Ukraine preparation not preparing, but feeding. The FSB's Ukraine unit had expanded from 30 officers to 160 between 2019 and 2022, a 5-fold increase that reflects how seriously Putin was building toward the invasion. That unit was supposed to be the tip of the spear, cultivating the political networks inside Ukraine that would collaborate with Russian forces, identifying the pressure points in Ukrainian society that could be exploited, and assessing, honestly, whether Ukraine's military and civilian population would resist or capitulate. It was the FSB that Putin trusted to answer the one question that determined everything. What will Ukraine actually do when we arrive? The answer the FSB delivered was the answer Putin wanted. Ukraine was weak. Its government was illegitimate. Its military was hollow. There was an entire alternative political structure waiting in the wings, ready to step forward and accept Russian governance the moment the old order collapsed. The invasion would be, as Steele summarizes the FSB's assessment, a walkover. Kyiv would fall within days. Russia would be welcomed as liberators. None of this was true. Ukrainian polls from the period showed that a significant majority of citizens were prepared to resist a Russian invasion by force. Ukraine's military, while outgunned, had spent 8 years restructuring itself after the Donbass experience and training with NATO advisors who had identified and addressed some of its most critical weaknesses. The alternative political structure that the FSB promised was waiting to take over existed primarily in FSB reports written by officers who needed the invasion to appear viable to justify the budgets they were consuming and the covert operations they were supposedly running. As a U.S. official told the Washington Post in the aftermath, Russia had set up an entire war effort to seize strategic objectives that were beyond their means. The mistake was, in that official's word, fundamental, not a miscalculation on the margins, a foundational failure to understand what they were walking into. A failure that the FSB, which was paid billions of dollars specifically to prevent, actively made worse by suppressing accurate information and replacing it with comfortable fiction. The FSB did not deceive Putin purely out of malice, though malice was certainly present. It deceived him because of a dynamic that Putin himself created and that Christopher Steele identifies with precision. I don't think you'd want to be anywhere near Putin when you brought bad news. And, of course, what that means is the distortion of information going up to leadership is quite significant. An intelligence organization that punishes accurate bad news and rewards comfortable optimism will, over time, stop producing accurate bad news. The incentive structure is unambiguous. FSB officers who reported that Ukraine was better prepared than expected, that the political landscape was more resistant than projected, that the money allocated for subversion operations was not producing the promised results. Those officers risked careers, freedom, and in some cases, their lives. FSB officers who reported that everything was proceeding according to plan, that Ukraine would fold, that the investment had been worth it, those officers received promotions, budgets, and continued access to the financial flows they were skimming. The FSB is, as the New York Times has noted, less a functioning intelligence agency than a political instrument, one born from the ashes of the KGB that produced Putin, carrying the same institutional habits of fabrication and blame-shifting that defined its predecessor. Putin understood this about the FSB when it served his purposes. In 1999, as prime minister, he used the FSB's capacity for manufactured reality to blame Chechen militants for apartment bombings in Moscow, bombings that subsequent evidence suggested the FSB itself may have been involved in staging. The manufactured threat opened the door for a new Chechen war that Putin used to consolidate his power. He built the FSB to lie, then he trusted it to tell him the truth about the most consequential decision of his presidency. The organization did what it was built to do. 4 years into the war that the FSB told Putin would last days, the corruption has not been corrected. It has metastasized. In January 2024, 3 FSB officers were arrested for accepting 5 billion rubles, approximately $55 million in bribes. 4 months later, a former FSB officer specializing in combating online crime was sentenced to 9 years in prison for accepting a $1.7 million payment from a hacking group in exchange for protecting them from prosecution. The hackers ultimately informed on him. He was caught by the criminal organization he had agreed to shield. The same dynamic infects Russia's military-industrial complex. Chatham House assessed in July 2025 that endemic corruption is a defining feature of Russia's defense production system. That corruption does not exist despite the system's functioning, but is, in fact, integral to how the system functions at all. Contracts are inflated, materials are substituted, inspections are purchased, the armor that is supposed to protect Russian soldiers, the ammunition that is supposed to supply them, the equipment that is supposed to keep them alive, all of it passes through a network of financial relationships that extract value at every step. Putin responds to each exposure with investigations. The investigations are conducted by people who are themselves, in many cases, participating in the same system they are investigating. The investigators who catch the corrupt are sometimes caught by other corrupt investigators. The system feeds on itself, an Ouroboros of institutional decay in which no reform reaches deep enough because the reformers are part of the problem they are trying to fix. This is what Putin built, an intelligence service that tells him what he wants to hear because telling him anything else is dangerous. A military-industrial complex that produces weapons on paper that may or may not perform as specified in the field. An inner circle whose primary loyalty is to its own financial survival and whose secondary loyalty, if it exists at all, is to the man at the top. Putin cannot fix this because he is this. The system reflects him, was built by him, and will outlast any individual case he makes an example of. The FSB told Putin in February 2022 that Ukraine would fall in days. Russia's forces are still fighting for individual villages in the Donbass 4 years later. The $5 billion that was supposed to hollow Ukraine out from the inside hollowed out the FSB instead, leaving Putin with an intelligence apparatus that was simultaneously stealing from him and assuring him that everything was fine. The knife in Putin's back was not unexpected. He handed the FSB the knife himself. He just never imagined they would use it on him.